Hey Grandmasters, it's Mike from the WCA. We're going to take a look at our first video update from this season. It's a position that we looked at in week 1 for the 4 o'clock class, but we broke parts of it down and showed it to the 12 and 2 as well. Depending on the level of the student, there are lots of different things that you can teach from such a simple position. So hiding in this position, for example, is a lot of theory on how to play with just kings and pawns. Right now that might not be so clear because you see those queens and rooks on the board. So you're going to have to get used to being able to picture the position without any power pieces at all. It's a very, very important concept. So masters pretty much always know who wins the king and pawn ending. So in their mind, whenever they have the opportunity to trade all of the pieces off, and only leaving kings and pawns, they're going to do that if they know the position is either winning for them or they have no losing chances. And that's the case in the position that you're looking at here. So the first question we asked the players was, number one, what kind of position is this? Because the material was equal. We got that out of the way pretty quickly. Each team has a queen, a rook, and 3 pawns. But when you ask a student, what type of position? Is this a middle game or an end game? It can be confusing because an endgame, for the most part, is a position where the primary purpose is to push a pawn to the other side and make a queen. So you can imagine you having a rook, your opponent having a rook, 3 pawns each. If the kings are safe or even working in an endgame, how are you going to win? You can't win with the rook. I mean, I have a rook too, so the only way you're going to win is to push one of your pawns across. And that can be the case with queen against queen, bishop versus knight. Whenever you have a position where the main goal is to make a queen, then you're in what we call an endgame. Here it's slightly different. It's going to turn into an endgame, but there is enough power on the board right now to play for checkmate, especially white. And the main reason for that is the weakness of the black's king's his position. Being in the corner is safe enough to hide from checks. The problem is the pawn structure in front of the king, and I'll highlight these with this mouse here, is so weak that there's a great opportunity for white to not only attack those pawns, but to do so in a way that's going to threaten checkmate. So a couple of more observations we looked at. You'll notice that the black queen is attacking the white rook. And it is white's turn in this position, otherwise you could just take that rook. But there's a tactic involved here. White could protect the rook, and the position would be, relatively equal if you keep those rooks and queens on the board. But what white does is first plays queen e7, and it's a really, really interesting move because you're telling black, okay, look, you can take my rook here on g4, and then I have the option at some point to take yours. But queen e7 does more than just offer a rook trade. It's threatening checkmate. So, if you play some move, you see this pawn here is being attacked. So if you play some silly move like rook d6, you're going to get checkmated here on f8 in one move. So that's not going to work. So what else? How do you guard that pawn? You can try something silly with the queen, moving it to d4, and that obviously is going to just hang the queen. But I want you to look at this position. This is the part where we broke down for our 12 and 2 o'clock group. So this is obviously a complete win for white. There's no way that you could play this out as black. You're completely lost. But the reason we showed it to them is hiding in this position are some elementary checkmates that you need to know. So, for example, what to do with your rook? It's being attacked right away. So if you just randomly moved it away, let's say you moved it to a8, there are several forced checkmates here, and what we'd recommend that you do is put this position up on your board and play them out. Just mess around with the pieces, move them around, look for checks, look for checkmates. You're not going to play this out for a win. I mean, it's obvious white is winning, but it's worth spending the time just learning some patterns here. For example, if you play rook g4, you're threatening mate in 1. So if the queen takes this pawn here on f6, how to get out? You can't play a move like rook g8, preparing to block, because you just take the pawn check. Rook g7, and again you have mate in 1, just queen takes pawn. But for players that are rated under 1,000, for example, if you set this up on the board, there's so much to learn from just this very, very simple position. For example, you can just take the rook, but what about queen d8? Missing mate in one is not the point. The point of this is to teach the x-ray attack. For example, the rook here on g7 in this position is forced to back up and block the check. This rook can come up the board and capture, creating a checkmate here. So when it goes back, you'll see that this white rook is kind of passing through the square that the black rook was just on, and you have a mate. And believe it or not, that's how players really, really learn these patterns. Just solving a puzzle is not going to do it. It certainly helps, but playing these positions out by yourself will go a long, long way. So just set these positions up on the board, fool around with them, and see if you can come up with some of your own patterns. Okay, great. So anyway, back to the game. So after queen e7, black was pretty much forced to swap the rooks off. And he did. He took on g4 first. And here white has a choice. You can obviously take the rook back with check, and that always looks like, you know, a pretty good idea, but it's actually a mistake, because if you take the rook right away, the king's going to come to g7, and if you look at this position long enough, you'll realize that white's not going to win this, nor is black. The problem is, with only the queens on the board, how are you going to break down the black pawn structure? The king is going to protect all the pawns. The black queen will protect the king from checks, and if you start advancing the white pawns up the board, you're going to open up the white king. So this is most likely going to end in a draw. A stronger player might be able to trick a weaker player in this type of position, but for the most part, the game is completely a draw. However, going back, after the white rook was captured here on g4, black has a very strong in-between move. Queen takes f6 check. And by doing that, you give black a problem here. You can block the check with your queen, or you can move the king. In the game, the player blocked with the king, moved the king, which was the better move, and I'll show you why in a moment. So the game continuation was queen takes rook. And then we'll show you the rest in a second. Had he blocked the check back here with this move, there's a little bit of a difference. Queen takes rook. Now queen to g8 is forced, and now you trade the queens, and you'll notice that the king is on g8. And that's one full step away from where he is in the main line. So again, just in the back of your mind, remember the king is on g8 in this line. So in the actual game, here, after queen takes f6, king g8, now you take the rook, king has to go to g7, and now white trades the queens off. And I would recommend that you pause the video if you're from the 12 or 2 o'clock group, and make sure you see the move that forces the queens off the board. The 4 o'clock group had to calculate all of this out without moving the pieces. So anyway, queen g5 is the answer. It's check. You attack the black queen as well, so she has no choice but to take. You take back with the pawn, and you have a 3-pawn to 2 advantage, and the black pawns are split. Believe it or not, this is not going to win itself. If you got this position in a tournament game, you still have a lot of work to do. As a matter of fact, there were so many different variations that we could show you from here. We could do 10 different videos on the types of positions that can come from this. We're going to show you 3 or 4 examples here. So if you happen to spot something that you think was winning or drawing or just interesting, you can always bring it into class, because we're not going to cover everything here, just some of the main points. Okay, so black pretty much is not going to be able to win this pawn here, because if he attacks it with the king, you'll be able to protect with the pawn. So black decides to chase the pawn off the board by making a trade, and there's a purpose to this trade. So white takes, black takes. Now what's the purpose? By getting rid of a pair of pawns, you leave a 2-on-1 advantage for white, and that sets some very interesting traps, because if white's not careful, black can trick white into a position where having an extra pawn is completely a draw. And we'll show you some of those variations here. Now, as white, you could make a mistake right away and move a pawn, by moving a pawn to g4 here. And let's make sure we have the right variations. Queen h6, king h6, king h3, and then f5 from black. Okay, here we go. This was the position I was talking about. Once you got a position like this, a lot of players with the white pieces will think, let me trade off my one pawn, the extra pawn here, for this guy, and that'll leave me a passed pawn here, and I'm going to be winning the game. You have to be very, very careful with that type of thinking unless you know some king and pawn theory. So for example, let's take a look at the move g4, which would be a double question mark move. However, it's still tricky. Now, why is it a double question mark move? It's because it leads to a draw. However, if you're playing black, how do you draw this position? The most obvious thing to do would be to just take the pawn. Well, if I take the pawn and white takes back, I get to take what's known as opposition, and that means the two kings are face to face with one box in between. And I know, or I've heard, that if I can take opposition in a king and pawn ending, that I'm going to be able to draw this game. The problem here is you're not going to keep the opposition very long. It happens to be white's turn. White wants it to be black's turn, so black would have to give up the opposition. So to do that, you just play the move f3, and now there are some problems. If you play king f6, which seems the most natural move, white then plays the move king f4. And I highlighted those three squares because those are the critical squares in this type of setup. If the white king can reach one of those three squares, it's an automatic win. And we'll show you how. What does black do? If black happens to go to our right, if you're playing the white pieces, that's to the right, then you come in on the left by making a diagonal move, and you're taking over more squares in this territory here. The whole idea is to push the king back and having your king ahead of the pawn. So king f7. Now again, you want to get forward with your king. The best way to do that is to take opposition, force the king to either go back, left, or right. So in this case, he's going to the left, so we go diagonal to the right, taking more space. If king e6, these types of moves, then you can push the pawn one square because the black king not only is not able to advance, but let's say when he goes back, you get to move the pawn again. And by moving it again, we create a position here where you'll see the pawn that's trying to queen only needs to be on the fifth rank here with the king one line in front of it. Normally the king has to be able to take opposition or get two lines in front of a pawn, but it works out mathematically that if the pawn is on the fifth, see the number 5 here, and the king is on the sixth, that's enough to win. The reason is here, for example, on king f8, and this you just have to calculate out, you get to play king f6, and the game is over because on king g8, you're just going to take over the queening square here, and the game is over. You just push your pawn in, and you'll make a queen, right? Okay, so let's go back to this move g4. You saw what happened if black takes the pawn. They're going to lose. However, the correct move for black, hopefully you found this, was king g5. Not taking the pawn, but advancing your king and asking white what to do here. The choices are not easy for white. This game is a complete draw. For example, if they protect this pawn, because it is getting attacked twice, right? So if you protect it with pawn f3, then we simply trade. Pawn has to take back, and then back your king up. The idea of backing the king up is we're going to wait for white to try to advance their king. If they play king h4, you should all know this by now, king h6, keep the opposition. If you get checked, you blockade. The king protects the pawn, and here we have to backpedal or step back because we don't know which way this king's going to try to break in, to the right or to the left. So what we'll do is backpedal, wait for the king to commit himself, and then we'll just follow him. So for example, if he goes to the left, we go to the left, always taking opposition. Check, blockade, protects, backpedal. This time he goes to the right, we go to the right, check, king g8, only move to protect the pawn, stalemate. Okay, so back again to king g5. If f3, we trade the pawns. Okay, well, what if white takes? Well, here we're going to take back, but the problem is, as we had shown in those other highlights, this king needs to be able to take opposition from this guy. And right now there's a diagonal opposition, but in order to win, the king needs to get to one of these three squares. And that's not going to happen, because on king g3, we retake opposition, and I'll show you those critical squares. There's no way the white king can get there. So this game would actually turn out to be a draw. If king f3, simply king f5, and the game was, is over. It's a draw. Okay, so going back, you see that g4 would be a big mistake. So that's why back here, and Rusa was telling the students this over and over again, you have to activate your king. Use your king in the endgame, especially with an extra pawn. Take over those squares, and at the right moment, you can trade pawns. So black played king g6, and now g4 is a winning move. Why? If you take, we take back, we have the opposition, and it doesn't matter here, as you'll see, we're already on one of the three critical squares. Black tries to get in front, we retake the opposition, and now he has to go left, right, or back. If he goes to the right, we go diagonal forward, king f7, king f5. Notice how the opposition rule keeps taking place over and over. King e7, king g6. Sometimes the king will advance, hoping that you make another king move in the wrong direction, and he'll actually sneak in front and take your pawn. But whenever that happens, you can move the pawn 2 squares, and once these squares are taken over, that king's going to have to back up. Backs up, pawn f5, and that's that same rule we showed you before, that if the king is on the 6th rank and the pawn is on the 5th, it's always going to be a win, in these types of positions anyway. So pawn f5, king f8, and I'm pausing a little bit. I hope you guys are too. Just make sure you master this pattern. King f6, you have to take opposition here. If some of you looked at pawn f6, no good. King g8, pawn f7, king f8, and there's your stalemate. That's a draw. So back here, look at the pattern again. Take opposition, king g8, king e7, game over. You'll promote that pawn and queen. Okay, so there's a lot here. I hope you guys enjoyed it. If the more ambitious of you want to see this again, spend the time. It's worth it. And please don't forget, with those basic checkmates, you can set up the board anytime you want and just do them on your own and just see what kind of patterns you can come up with yourself. All right, we'll see you guys on Sunday.